What does it take to become a king feared across continents? To earn a name so legendary that centuries later, it still symbolizes courage, war, and power. Richard I of England, known forever as Richard the Lionheart, was not simply a king. He became one of history's most iconic warrior rulers. Born in 1157 into the powerful Plantagenet dynasty, Richard was raised in a world of royal ambition, betrayal, and relentless warfare. He was the son of Enrique II de Inglaterra, one of Europe's most powerful monarchs. But Richard's path was never simple. From an early age, he was immersed in political conflict. His family itself was divided by power struggles. Rebellions, shifting alliances, and dynastic tensions shaped his youth. Unlike many kings remembered for administration, Richard's true identity was forged through battle. He became known for extraordinary military skill, personal bravery, and fierce determination. Educated as nobility, Richard mastered politics, strategy, and leadership. But his greatest passion was warfare. As Duke of Aquitaine, he faced rebellions early, learning how to command armies and crush opposition. His battlefield reputation began forming long before he wore England's crown. Richard was charismatic, but also ruthless. To allies, he was inspiring. To enemies, terrifying. This duality would define his reign. When his father's empire became fractured by internal disputes, Richard joined conflicts even within his own family. The Plantagenet dynasty was powerful, but deeply unstable. Richard and his brothers often fought over inheritance, influence, and succession. These experiences hardened him further. By 1189, following Henry II's death, Richard ascended the throne of England. But unlike many monarchs, England itself was not his primary obsession. His ambitions stretched far beyond domestic rule. Because at that moment, Christian Europe was consumed by one overwhelming cause: the Crusades. Jerusalem, one of Christianity's holiest cities, had fallen to the great Muslim leader Saladin. The loss sent shockwaves through Europe, and Richard saw an opportunity, not only to defend Christendom, but to secure eternal glory. Almost immediately, he committed himself to the Third Crusade. To finance this massive campaign, Richard taxed heavily, sold royal offices, and raised enormous resources. His famous statement reportedly reflected his priorities. He would sell London itself if he could find a buyer. This was not the behavior of a passive ruler. Richard was singularly focused on war. As he prepared for crusade, he was already becoming mythic. A king who sought not comfort, but conquest. A monarch whose sword would define him more than his throne. And soon, Richard the Lionheart would march eastward toward one of history's most legendary military campaigns, where his courage, his brutality, and his legend would be tested against empires. In 1190, Richard the Lionheart departed Europe, not as an ordinary king, but as one of Christendom's most powerful military leaders. His mission was clear: reclaim Jerusalem. The Third Crusade was one of the largest military campaigns of the medieval world, and Richard stood at its center. Traveling first through France and Sicily, Richard formed uneasy alliances with fellow Crusader rulers, including Philippe II de France. But politics among Christian kings were often as dangerous as battles themselves. Tension, rivalry, and ambition followed them constantly. Richard's personality was bold, but not diplomatic. His strength was war, not compromise. As Crusader forces advanced, Richard demonstrated remarkable battlefield leadership. During the siege of Acre, one of the Crusade's most critical early victories, Richard's tactical brilliance became undeniable. Despite illness, he inspired troops relentlessly. His presence alone elevated morale. And when Acre fell in 1191, Richard's legend grew dramatically. But victory came with brutality, Thousands of Muslim prisoners were executed under Richard's command. This ruthless act demonstrated his uncompromising nature. To supporters, he was defending Christian power. To critics, he embodied crusading brutality. Yet, militarily, Richard remained extraordinary. His greatest opponent was Saladin himself, a brilliant Muslim commander. Saladin had already become one of history's most respected leaders. Their rivalry became legendary. At the Battle of Arsuf, Richard proved why he was called Lionheart. Saladin's forces launched relentless attacks, but Richard's disciplined leadership and devastating counterattack secured a major Crusader victory. His battlefield command was unmatched. He inspired loyalty, fear, and admiration. Even Saladin reportedly respected Richard's military genius. Though enemies, they represented two of the era's greatest commanders. Yet, despite victories, Jerusalem remained elusive. Richard repeatedly advanced, but strategic limitations, supply concerns, and political instability complicated total conquest. The crusade became a grueling test of endurance. Richard won battles, but ultimate victory remained uncertain. And though he would not retake Jerusalem, his campaign secured critical coastal territories, preserved Christian military presence, and solidified his reputation as one of medieval history's greatest warrior kings. Richard did not fully achieve his original goal, but he became something perhaps even greater, a legend. Richard the Lionheart's greatest power was not merely his sword, it was his reputation. Across Europe, he became the ultimate symbol of medieval kingship, brave, fearless, unstoppable. His victories during the Crusades elevated him into near-mythical status. Songs, stories, and chroniclers celebrated him as Christianity's champion. His battlefield courage became legendary. Richard often fought directly alongside his soldiers, leading charges personally, exposing himself to extraordinary danger. This was rare for kings, and it fueled his image as a true warrior monarch. But Richard's reign was marked by contradiction. Though King of England, he spent remarkably little time there. His focus remained military glory abroad. To finance wars, he imposed heavy taxation. England often served more as a resource base than a governing priority. For many subjects, Richard was an absent ruler, but internationally, he was revered. His rivalry with Saladin further amplified his fame. Despite fierce conflict, mutual respect emerged between the two leaders. Historical accounts describe gestures of chivalry and diplomacy unusual for such brutal warfare. This dynamic added complexity to Richard's legend. He was not merely a conqueror, he was part of one of history's most iconic military rivalries. Richard's courage was undeniable, but his ambitions were costly. Wars drained resources. Political tensions in Europe persisted. And while his military brilliance was unmatched, his kingdom remained vulnerable. Still, for medieval Europe, glory in battle often outweighed administrative concerns. Richard embodied that ideal completely. He was a king forged through war, whose identity transcended governance. And his name, Lionheart, became permanent, not because he ruled peacefully, but because he fought relentlessly. His legend outgrew his reign, and even today, Richard I remains one of history's definitive warrior kings. Capítulo 4. Capture, Ransom, and Return. In 1192, Richard began his journey home from the Crusades, but his trials were far from over. Traveling through Europe, Richard was captured near Austria by Duke Leopold V, a ruler Richard had previously insulted during the Crusades. For a king as famous as Lionheart, this was shocking. One of Europe's greatest warrior monarchs, now imprisoned. Leopold handed Richard over to the Holy Roman Emperor, Henrique VI, and an enormous ransom was demanded. The price was staggering. England was forced to raise unprecedented taxes and resources. Church treasures were melted, citizens were heavily burdened. The nation paid dearly for its king's freedom. Richard's capture revealed a harsh truth. Even legendary kings were vulnerable to political betrayal. Yet remarkably, his legend only intensified. The ransom itself became proof of his immense value. Few rulers in history commanded such a price. When Richard was finally released in 1194, he returned to England as both monarch and myth. But once again, he did not remain long. Richard quickly resumed military campaigns, this time defending his French territories. War continued to define him, not peace, not governance. His life was battle, and battle would ultimately claim him. In 1199, while besieging a small castle in France, Richard was struck by a crossbow bolt. The wound became infected, and soon, the Lionheart was dying. At only 41 years old, one of medieval history's most famous kings came to an end. Not in grand conquest, but in a relatively minor siege. Yet even in death, Richard's legend endured, because his story had become larger than life itself.
Capítulo 5.
The immortal legacy of Richard the Lionheart. Richard I died, but Richard the Lionheart never truly disappeared. His reign was relatively short. His time in England was limited. His political governance was imperfect. Yet history remembers him not for bureaucracy, not for diplomacy, and not for peace. History remembers Richard for war, for courage, for battlefield brilliance, for embodying the medieval ideal of heroic kingship. His name became immortal through legend, literature, and national identity. To generations of Europeans, Richard symbolized what a warrior king should be: bold, relentless, fearless. His Crusader image inspired chroniclers, poets, and future rulers alike. Even centuries later, Richard remained deeply embedded in English mythology. Stories of his heroism appeared in tales of Robin Hood, where Richard often represented rightful leadership and noble strength. This mythological portrayal further elevated him beyond historical reality. But Richard's legacy is complex. He was undeniably courageous, yet also ruthless. He pursued glory at immense financial and human cost. His campaigns were marked by extraordinary military skill, but also severe brutality. Like many great historical figures, he embodied both admiration and contradiction. Still, few rulers have achieved the same legendary permanence. Richard's military achievements, his confrontation with Saladin, his imprisonment, his ransom, and his dramatic death created one of history's most compelling royal narratives. He became more than a king. He became an archetype, a symbol of warrior nobility, a ruler whose reputation transcended borders and centuries. In the end, Richard the Lionheart may not have secured Jerusalem, but he conquered something else: immortality through history. Because while kingdoms rise and fall, legends endure. And among medieval kings, few names roar louder than Lionheart.